So Francis Ngannou, as I mentioned earlier, was on the MMA Hour yesterday with Ariel Helwani and was talking about basically what happened in terms of what had been announced previously by the UFC. Namely, he is no longer with them. And by the way, there is some kind of way we should talk about this. Was he stripped? Did he relinquish the title? I realize that 6 one way, half a dozen the other, but it does kind of frame the story. Anyway, he basically explained why he did not re-sign with them. Why, in other words, why a deal could not be reached, what he was looking for, what it meant to him, and ultimately why it failed. BC, here is what he basically said, as you know, but just to recap for the audience's sake. He said that he was given a pretty good offer from a monetary perspective, approximately $8 million a fight, which is on par with.
I think it was just for the Jones fight at that level, but the money was really good across the way.
I'm going to imagine on top of that would be pay-per-view points.
Right.
Like it would be $8 million. So you're talking, if it sells well, in excess of $10 million for a fight, potentially more, but somewhere around that. So it's a pretty good offer. You got to say that's not a bad offer. Certainly, that's a very.
But
competitive
he wanted
offer.
a 3-fight deal, and they were not willing to move.
He wanted a 3-fight deal, no extra provisions or hang-ups or clauses, just 3 fights in and out. That way he could be done in a year and get another new contract. But more to the point, what he also wanted was health insurance, not merely for himself, but for the roster. Whew. He wanted someone to be basically a liaison that would be working on behalf of the fighters with the executive UFC team to make sure that their interests were met. And of course, the UFC declined all of this. They were not interested in this at all, and so an agreement could not be reached. BC, there are a lot of reasons why he said what he said, namely that he had a certain set of values, and then living these values were incredibly important to him. He didn't want to be a taker. What do you make of what he gave up? What do you make of how he justified it? How do you assess what he said yesterday?
I was already pro-Francis in this specific situation based on all the facts we knew. But I have to say, after watching that interview with Ariel and hearing he's not taking this personal. He's cool, calm, collected, and he believes that he's on a certain path that, there was a cool, he's so... Damn, does he have principle, okay? Like, more than I even thought. So when we were debating after this news first happened on, my live chat on our Monday episode, it was more about, did he make the right decision business-wise? And, how possible is it now moving forward that things can happen, certain fights, certain paydays can come that would justify the move he made? What I found out here from Francis's words directly from him is that the money is like the least of this. This is ultimately about respect. And he, without trying to further the divide between him and the company, answered Ariel's questions honestly to reveal multiple times in his journey where, beyond just the general feeling of fighters, to some degree feeling like cattle under the current UFC business structure, he felt distinctly many times he just wasn't treated like a man. And that, that obviously crosses over to a level of negotiation and all of that. But this is a man of principles who, look, from here on out, he's golden. No matter what happens, no matter if he ever fights again, no matter if he goes to boxing and wins the heavyweight championship or any approximation in between, because it was only about principles at the end of the day. It wasn't even about boxing necessarily, even though that was a big stopgap in the negotiation between them where, UFC looked at certain things he wanted and were like, absolutely not. And he looked at certain things they wanted and just the same. But it wasn't even about, because he said, I was willing to fight a 3-fight contract, which meant Jones, which meant trilogy with Stipe, and which meant probably a rematch with Jones. And he was like, I was willing to do those fights in succession in 1 calendar year and then try boxing. Like, this isn't even about money or boxing or all of that. It's about one man's belief in how he should be treated. And because that's so strong and because he believes in himself, because he's been through so much shit and climbed through and got through it, that, like I said, when I say he's okay moving forward no matter what happens, literally he is. Like, this is not about money. This was about respect and how you were treated. And he was actually willing to risk his standing for the future generation, for the fighters on the bottom of the card. And no one expected UFC's just going to take us out. Yeah, you know what, Francis, you're right. Let's give everybody health insurance. And it's never going to happen, right, under the way things are set up now. So you could say, okay, well, that shows he didn't really want to fight. Really? That doesn't show that at all. That shows that actually meant something to him enough. Like, nothing's going to change in the overall picture here of fighter treatment unless people with something to risk are willing to stand in the line and risk it. This guy was willing to risk it all. And the way that he described it, every turn in the negotiations, extra money was just being thrown at him. And he said he felt like he was slapped in the face with money and just kind of told to shut up here. Here's some extra money, take it, be happy. That UFC finally found in the way that they negotiate and control fighters, They finally found their equal across the board that they couldn't break. And I only mean they're equal from the standpoint that he's willing to stand on his principles above all else in the same way UFC is willing to stand on its own. And their principles are cutthroat, successful, dominant business. Any tactic possible, leaking false information, any tactic possible. They already have extreme control on the contracts and the sunset clauses, lack of sunset clauses, and the fact that they can match for a year. They already have that thing locked down. They're not going to budge because at the end of the day, it's about money. And so is business. I'm not naive. And they feel that in any kind of negotiation at the end, one of two things can happen. They can throw enough money because everybody's got a price for the $1 million man, and that will be it. Or if that person's just crazy, they can tarnish them on the way out and push them away. Only Francis wasn't willing to break for that. And he wasn't willing to break for the things he also stood for. There's no, the reaction to him negative that I saw immediately was like, oh man, he's representing himself. This doesn't sound like a sound businessman. He's going to lose out in the end. The UFC made the right financial move, and they might have actually, for their own good for the future, made the right financial move. It might be the perfect move for them to let him go. But what he did by doing it the way he did was just show to me that they found somebody that's just not going to budge. And you just don't find that on this level when you have something to lose, except for possibly Randy Couture at times, which is interesting that they told him, oh, go ask Randy. And he did. And he got the true inside story of what he was up against. But the principles meant so much to him because Francis is of the rare breed at the end of the day. And we all strive to be this, but we also know the realities in certain times of our own morals and realities with our bills that, at the end of the day, Luke, we try to not make decisions about money, but sometimes we have to and put it all in that. For Francis, it's not about that because he has faith and a belief that's bigger. And I don't just necessarily mean from a religious sense, and that's awesome. I mean in just his faith that they can't control him, and he's not going to be taken down by what happens here in this negotiation. He was willing to risk it all. And when the negative reaction is always to him, all right, Francis, that's cool, but this is ultimately about money. He's showing you at each turn it wasn't about any of that. It was only about what mattered. So, Luke, I actually don't care anymore in the long run who wins this transaction, because the negative reaction is always, then do something about it. The fighters are the ones who are at fault. They're the ones signing the contracts. So it's actually taking somebody with something to risk to stand in there and not do it. Mm-hmm. He was the first major one on this level in this climate to be willing to do that, because no change is going to happen unless somebody does. He was actually willing to do that. How else could you criticize him here? Unless you are only about money, how else can you criticize him here? This is the beginning of the future. In Major League Baseball, everybody got one-year contracts no matter what, which put complete control on the owners and in terms of like, you're only as good as your last year. That got changed. Free agency changed. This is the beginning of monster change, I believe, and it's going to take some time. And even he said he knows it, and he doesn't believe there's going to be any, huge major fallout from this in that regard. But business doesn't. He stood across from him in a poker match, Luke, and wasn't willing to budge, and it says something so much about who he is, and that's the only way change is going to happen, man. And I don't know, I'm humbled by this. I'm really seriously humbled by this, that somebody had that much, that at the end of the day, they could not be budged or bought. I mean, Khabib to a certain degree too, in his own story, in his own way. But that's the only way this machine's going to change, is in the way these guys are treated, if somebody has that level of balls. So, you know what? He did already win. And by the way, he already accomplished a shit ton if he never did fight again. Not like anyone thinks he wouldn't fight again.
True.
But if he just walked away, you know what I mean? He already did win. Because at the end of the day, principle matters, Luke. And you're a man of principles. The things that you believe in, you don't budge on. But, we all hope when it's our time, when that's at risk, and we have to stand and take a stand for what we believe in, that we're willing, that we have the balls to stand up and risk it. This guy did have the balls, and I think only good things are going to come for him as a reaction to that. And I think slowly but surely, this is the opening of that door, Luke, for change. I mean, is it only about money at the end of the day? And these guys are just cattle, and we're just, we'll just replace you with another one, or were some serious things exposed here in this process about how this business really works?
I think there's a lot to get to with your assessment there. I think I agree with much of it. I do have some mixed feelings along the way. Not about the big stuff. Like if you watch the interview, what do you notice? I think you brought it up. Like Francis is at ease with this decision, and that tells you, like, I will say this in MMA. I've really noticed this in MMA, because the game is so brutal. We kind of always distill it down to its essentials. It's about money, get what you can, and then get out. And there's really no judgment about that. That's what I've considered not merely business operations, business standards, but sometimes best practices. But it is unusual in your life to actually see someone who lives by principle. You don't actually find many people who do that, rich or poor, because it typically comes with costs, and those costs people don't want to pay. I don't mean just financial costs, although those could be those as well, but ostracism costs, public embarrassment, and if you're a public figure, how you're remembered. You risk all of those things. And so the reason why none of that bothers them is because if your principles and your values actually matter to you and you actually live by them, what virtue is its own reward. Like, what is the reward for being virtuous? That you are virtuous. It's not because it transactionally necessarily leads to other things. And I do want to say to this, BC, and like, you're like, it could be the sort of great things. Could be. Hope it is. Ain't necessarily a guarantee. This could be the start of, if he falls flat on his face, a retraction where people are like, he's the cautionary tale. But he took that risk knowing that. He took that risk knowing it could go my way, where I get the, let's say, Tyson Fury fight, maybe even goes back to the UFC at some point. Who knows? There's a lot of ways it goes where it goes well. But there's a lot of scenarios where it goes poorly for him, and he is risking falling flat on his face in order to live with his principles. I just want to be clear with folks. I hope it's the beginning of good news. It is not necessarily a guarantee. In fact, I would say it's pretty far from it, at least for now. The other part to me,
I think in the long run, he's going to be just fine. In the long run,
I think long term, he will be remembered quite fondly for living his values, but that the choice he made turned out to be a lucrative one for his career. I mean, there's a lot. Okay, think about anybody in sports who took a stand with ownership for themselves. How often were they financially rewarded, especially if we're talking like big structural changes that the industry needed? Dude, a lot of them ended up broke. A lot of them ended up remembered as a footnote. A lot of them lost. You fought the law wins typically, right? So I just want to be clear about that. It feels good. And I also want to say this to the audience as well. Saying, like, I'm not accusing you of this because we'll be there no matter what, but like for people who are fans of MMA who maybe like are proud of what Francis did, or at least find some value in it as well, saying on social media that you liked Francis is great, and telling your friends that you like Francis is great. If you actually want to support Francis, you have to go and follow what he does and or buy his pay-per-views. And of course, he has the obligation to make that a good sales pitch. He has to do something of value. But I'm merely pointing out, saying on social media that you like Francis or you agree with him, that's worth nothing. It's just not worth a damn thing. The only thing that matters is how you vote with your dollars and your attention dollars in the end. And I think the last thing I'd say, though, is this is the part, BC, I wanted to go back and forth with you on a little bit. Dude, it's funny, right? Because if you look at what he asked, he even says, I wasn't expecting to get everything. The money, it sounds to me like the money was there. Like, that was not at all. Like, he would have taken that offer if that was all he cared about. And obviously it wasn't the
competition offer. Do you think this guy's afraid of anything?
It's ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. But I will say that I think what matters to him is if you come from a deeply impoverished place where it is extremely difficult to escape, I could imagine the guilt you might live with by what you would consider leaving others behind. And I don't think he wants to live with that guilt. And it looks like he is living guilt-free, if ever there was. But this is the interesting part to me. If you are asking for things what's kind of funny is asking for health insurance. Dude, these guys are not really independent contractors. They're basically employees. They're miscategorized. And he's asking for things that I don't think are unfair. However, we also know they are deeply unrealistic to do. Meaning, to me, he went into that meeting knowing there was going to be a no.
Yes. But if you have
Are you negotiating in good faith when you do that?
Yes.
Tell me why.
Because this is like, these aren't like, okay, you may look at this and just say, dude, that's business in America or anywhere worldwide. That's business. It's cutthroat. It's not personal. It's business, the famous line. But that's also what this is about for Francis. Like, he's not holding a grudge. Whether it was slapping the money in his face or trying to defame him or trying to put pressure on him, like, he never buckled because it's not about the money to him. And because it's not personal, it's just business. What was the spirit of your question specifically?
That he went into the negotiations knowing he was asking the impossible.
This is a company that we're not alleging certain things are going on. Like, this is illuminating to us to actually see the behind the scenes. And anyone that wants to say, "Oh, Ariel's such a prior,"
that's the job.
You don't get this information if somebody that's in a spot to interview on that platform isn't doing exactly that. But this is a company that is publicly lobbying against its own fighters' right to organize, right? I mean, with the actual legal structure of the law are trying to build in as many obstacles to keep the fighters at bay and lessen their rights, that it's in good faith because he's doing it for the right reasons. It's not about anything, Luke, but money. It's about like how people are treated. And here's somebody who actually looks at their life and their career through the right glasses. That, again, we all hope we do when it's our moment of time, but do we really? It wasn't about the legacy or the career and the money or any of that. So, yeah, I believe he wants to see change, Luke. And again, the only way change ever happens is if somebody with something to lose is willing to risk that. So, I've seen the negative response. Like I said, bad businessman, or he's just trying to make himself look good.
You can't say
it's
a bad business decision if what he actually values is the principle more than the money. In that case, he is actually honoring the things that matter most to him. Not maximizing the dollars in that particular circumstance would not be the high priority. I
mean, he had to essentially, on a business standpoint, cut ties with his own agent, right? Because of the heat that was being created in a lot of different ways. And I know Francis went on Ariel's show and said this wasn't a CAA versus Endeavor thing in the end. That had nothing to do with it. But there was a lot of heat. Those text messages, there was a lot of heat that was building up around. And yet Francis said, okay, I'll just do it myself. And Luke, not comparing Francis's business life and walk to yours, but if you're not the number one advocate for yourself, then nobody else will be.
Gonna do that.
So all these people DM me and be like, BC, you are looking at this through the rosiest, romanticized glasses. Like, at the end of the day, this is about business, and Francis doesn't have the acumen. And look what he just did. He's representing himself. He doesn't know what the hell he's doing. No, he knows exactly what he's doing, because nobody is going to fight for exactly what, not just you want, but what you need in a principle sense, better than you can. And damn, dude, it's not for everybody. No, not every person could do this, but I don't know why it rings so true to me. I mean, maybe because in our own business, Luke, I don't have an agent. You don't have an agent.
I had one. He dropped me.
Right, and I've had horrible experiences with one too. And this isn't necessarily against that, but it's the whole idea that at the end of the day, like, here's a real one. And it's funny because Francis called Mick Maynard a real one and said, despite all the negotiations, like, that's a real guy, and he didn't have the same about Hunter Campbell and Dana, which I think we can all understand based on their roles in the relationship. But no, Francis is a real one. And so I don't think we can play this mythical Paul Bunyan angle as much. Like, we can do it ad nauseum and not, I don't think, hit what the value of his character overall is. And it's not just in the fight game, it's everything he's went through to get here. You talk about make a movie about someone's life, like, drop everything and make that now, only it's still in motion and amazing things are happening. And Luke, I'm getting to the point that even though the odds were extremely against him on walking into a boxing ring under boxing rules against a current boxing heavyweight champion and thinking this is anything but a spectacle, part of me wants to cheer for him. Part of me wants to just believe that when you have this ridiculous level of self-belief, maybe this is a parallel to that McGregor magic when he was beating everybody and got the Floyd fight, and there were a lot of people, and there were parts of us that even wanted to, as knowledgeable combat sports fans, that were like, man, maybe he could, because he just doesn't know anything different but shooting for the stars, and he just makes things happen. Dude, I want to just believe that this is actually even possible for Francis to do that, because I'm not sure I've seen in sports something so real of the human makeup of who somebody is, what really matters to them, the journey they took to get there, how they've bounced back from adversity, and how they are so steadfast on their own goals and beliefs. And it wouldn't be, there's been athletes who had goals and beliefs that didn't seem to make realistic sense in the end. Tim Tebow wanted to be a starting NFL quarterback for a whole career, and all the things were being pushed against him, right? You'd have the miracle season. You get my point.
Yeah, I don't think Tim Tebow's a victim. I want to be
but you get my point, where there's certain people, Evander Holyfield, when he was in his late 40s, was still like, no, I'm here to become the undisputed champion. God told me I would, when we're like, when somebody like Francis now says, I'll probably this summer, I'm looking to do this absolutely ridiculous idea of calling up Anthony Joshua or Fury or Wilder or whatever and going across from him. I want to believe that when Yoel Romero gave that rant he did to Phil Murphy of ESPN, the go, anything's possible. Dude, I don't know about you, but I watched that probably about 4,000 times in a row after it happened. And I'm like, that's some of the realest stuff in this cowboy carnival combat sports world that we live in. And a lot of it we love, that griminess and the trash talk and all that bullshit and the pro wrestling side that comes with it. That's the realest thing I've actually ever heard in my life. Francis is the living embodiment of that. So, like, I'm not even counting him out in this crossover to boxing in some weird way. And, like, look, the odds, the structure, the system are so tilted against the fighters in such ridiculous ways that I'm getting to the point where I really don't understand how you can be a hardcore fan of this sport and also equally not care. It's one thing to say, I don't want to watch your show anymore because all you guys talk about is business and debate who's right or wrong. I don't care about the business. I care about the fights. I get that. But if you have a soul and you watch UFC on the reg,
there's a huge imbalance.
And you know how the sausage is being made, and some of it we're just finally getting the pieces and we're matching them together. That's why I always shout out the John Nashes and the other guy from MMA and anybody who's just sort of helping us
Kareem Zidane.
Piece it all together to understand. It's even more fucked up, this system, than I thought it was.
Yeah, I mean,
they have even more control than I ever imagined they do.
People think it's a dunk when they go, well, he left UFC, yeah, real smart guy, who are you going to fight out there? Right. The fact that he might not have a lot of great opponents inside MMA and has to go to boxing tells you how much the industry is controlled by a dominant single player. That it tells you the industry is fucked in that way, because like the number one heavyweight on the planet in MMA might have a hard time finding opponents that people care about, because the vast majority of them in that weight class and every other one are locked up by a single promoter. But let me make just one point, BC, that I just want to be clear about something. And I've been in MMA for a long time. And this is one thing that I've not always gotten right in my much smaller, more diminutive role relative to Francis Ngannou. It's infinitesimally smaller, but if you play a role in the sport, I think you should think about this. Fighter pay sometimes becomes what people think is a conversation about dollars. And the vast majority of the time, it is. There are a lot of people who feel like a lot of fighters who are underpaid and just want more money to get through the next camp or to reach a certain goal and then get out of the sport when they've got enough money, right? I just want to use fighting to get rich or to set my family up, buy some property, go on to my next chapter of my life. And I think that's all great. I think people associate fighter pay with dollars, but at the heart of fighter pay is actually about treatment and how we consider the plight of fighters more broadly, and whether or not we care about them, and whether or not we care about their interests and who's looking out for them. And by the way, often they are their own worst advocate. I saw Charles Jourdain speaking out against changes to fighter pay, which to me is incomprehensible. But this is the key for Francis, BC. This is the key. There are a lot of people who don't mind getting into the sport, taking from it, and leaving. And that's true of managers, fighters, promoters, media, brands who are sponsors, you name it. Francis, like all of us, has partly been a taker, right? He has been paid and he's rendered some services, but it looks to me like what he actually wants to do is to make MMA better. And he actually wants to sacrifice some of his long-term interests, including maybe even his short-term interests, in order to make MMA better. Now, I am skeptical this will work, quite candidly, but that is at the heart of what he is doing. That is what he is sacrificing on the altar of future greatness.